Hi, everyone. Well, in some ways, we've come to the top of Baden Hill. In other ways, maybe we've come to the bottom of Baden Hill. In any case, we've come to the last of our 7 units. And during this unit, our goal is to look back a little bit, to summarize some, but most importantly, we want to look at what's going on today. We want to try to understand what makes the world the way it is today. And so we will have lots of new information, but we will also have some review of old information. This unit is called Eternity. And if you remember, we had 4 units in a row that tried to get at the essence of what it means to be an American. And so we started with fights. We discussed the various kinds of fights that happened, including the Civil War. We talked about rights, speaking specifically about the Constitution, but also looking forward to the next unit, which was equality. And finally, we're ending with eternity. So these 4 units hopefully will be kind of a compact summary of some very important issues in American society, even as they impact us today. So this segment, this video installment, is going to discuss legacies. Now, one thing I have to say is an eternal perspective is not what everybody's looking for, and I truly understand that. But it's my belief that everyone has an eternal perspective. We all think about what we will leave behind, whether it's at a school or during a job that we have. There are many rewarding cases where we can leave behind something that makes others feel good and also makes ourselves feel as if we've accomplished something. We want to look first at presidents. The presidents since World War II, and we're going to actually include FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and we'll start with him. So let's take a look at what the legacy of each of the presidents of the last 70 years would be. And this assessment can change as time goes on. In the future, people might see people like President Nixon very differently from the way that we see him today. And that has already happened. We'll discuss that in a second. FDR. FDR is known for many things, and if you go to Washington, D.C. and see the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial, you'll understand that there are so many different aspects of his career, of his life, of the inspiration that he was during a very dark time of the United States. And so FDR represents the New Deal, the new dawn after the darkness of the Great Depression. It didn't come easily. Many historians have said that for as many successes FDR had, he had just as many failures. The key for him was he was willing to try new things, and he was willing to admit mistakes. Every president has black marks on their name. Maybe FDR's black mark is the Japanese internment that took place because of his executive order. And so FDR is known for the New Deal. He's also known for that panic during World War II, where Japanese people, Japanese Americans, were placed in prisons essentially because people were afraid of spying and somehow that these American citizens might help people that they were connected to in this country that was now our enemy. Another thing that FDR has to be known for, it's not just the grand idea of a New Deal, but specifically the entitlements that we have in our country. Entitlements means things that we as Americans are entitled to, things that we count on. And the 2 most important ones are Social Security and unemployment insurance. Okay, those are 2 that came about because of FDR. We could add to that Medicare. We'll talk about that later during the time of Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ. So FDR gets credit for Social Security, and the very difficult thing is that his plans, even though they lasted throughout some very difficult times, and even though they seemed as if they might last forever, it's clear now that Social Security is not stable. And it is likely that the trust fund that has been accumulating, or it had been accumulating, to support Social Security, that trust fund may be gone in 8 years from the time I'm making this video. We'll see if that happens. Everything changes because of the economy and costs in general. And so, the length of time that Social Security will be available, it changes. And there's an annual assessment, there's an annual guess as to how long Social Security benefits will last. Now, one thing that I learned in creating this video and learning this content is even when the trust fund is gone, Social Security benefits will still be paid for about 75 years just based on current taxes that are being collected. And that sounds like a really long time, longer than any of us have to worry about. But it's a little scary to think that we are creating something for our grandchildren and maybe your children that is going to disappear, something that people depend on when they reach retirement age. That could be gone. And so we need to understand that even though it seems like it's a long ways away, we should care about it. One thing that is creating some problems is the idea of tax cuts in our government is very popular. Everyone likes to receive Social Security benefits, and everyone likes tax cuts. The thing is, those two don't go together. So, enough said. FDR is well known for his New Deal, his entitlements, his strength during World War II, and we'll see what the future generations think of FDR. Now I'm going to move through the next presidents quite quickly because none of them served in office as long as FDR. President Truman served almost 2 full terms. He took over when FDR died in office and had some very important decisions to make. And so he's really known for his phrase, "The buck stops here." And that was very true during the Korean War. Now, President Truman served a term. He basically took over right at the beginning of FDR's 4th term, and he served that whole term, about 4 years. And then he was reelected through what was called the Whistle Stop campaign. He took a train to small towns all over the U.S., and he campaigned that way. And it was a very big deal because he was connecting with common people. And that was one of his gifts. People saw him as very relatable. But President Truman was more and more unpopular because of the Korean War. People were not happy that the U.S. was fighting another war after World War II in a faraway land for circumstances that didn't seem clear, and fighting with the United Nations rather than fighting a little bit more on its own. So President Truman had some ups, he had some downs. President Eisenhower, maybe he's known for the phrase military-industrial complex. We've discussed this, the idea that the military was becoming stronger and stronger, and when you need weapons, the industries, the factories make the weapons. But the factories are actually making money from making weapons. And so sometimes it's the factories that make more and more weapons, and then the military, because they have all these weapons, feels more comfortable using them. And so it's a cycle. The industry feeds into the military feeds into the industry. The interesting thing is Eisenhower knew more about the military maybe than any president in history because he was the commander of D-Day. He was in charge of all the forces in Europe. And he was very respected, but he was confronted with a Soviet Union that was not going to back down. And the U-2 incident was maybe the most tense moment of his administration, right at the end of his administration in 1960. And it didn't really end successfully. And it was clear that President Eisenhower knew that he was stuck, and the U.S. was stuck. Other than Eisenhower, you had Kennedy, who took over in 1960. And President Kennedy only served 3 years. And he was a symbol of a new beginning, a democratically elected president, a Democrat elected as president after a long term of a Republican president. It was a big change, and he didn't have a clear majority. He was remembered for his youth. His presidency was known as Camelot, and it was also marked by confrontation with the Soviet Union in the Bay of Pigs, in Cuba, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I would say JFK is really known for being assassinated, and the fact that his hope-filled presidency was cut short, and it affected every American, even those who didn't vote for him. So those are the 4 presidents that are kind of the building blocks of our world today, from World War II all the way to 1963. Now we need to move and talk about 2 other presidents that are much more complicated. President Johnson, LBJ, and President Nixon. Now, LBJ is known for his Great Society programs, his war on poverty, but he's also known for the war in Vietnam. And as a result, he took over for Kennedy in 63. He was elected in a landslide in 64, and he served then only 1 full term. Even though he could have run again, he chose not to. And that was largely because JFK's brother declared that he was going to run against President Johnson, or he would run for the Democratic nomination. And so LBJ, he realized that he was not popular, and he didn't want to fight that fight. And so some people would see him as a failure, but he was able to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Act of 1965, and he also he passed Medicare. Medicare takes care of retirement age people in the United States and gives them medical care, and that was a huge accomplishment. So that's what Johnson is known for. President Nixon, we usually think of Watergate when we think of President Nixon, and he is the only president ever to resign from office. He would have been impeached, and he wasn't impeached. There have only been 2 presidents that have been impeached, President Andrew Johnson and President Bill Clinton. But President Nixon would have been impeached, and he would have been convicted, most likely. Everything had turned against him because of evidence that came out. And at the same time, we need to remember that President Nixon was responsible for a better relationship with China, a better relationship with Russia, so the Soviet Union, and he started the Environmental Protection Agency. There are many things that happened during the time of President Nixon's presidency that are a part of his legacy. We have 2 other presidents then that followed. When President Nixon resigned, his vice president took over. President Ford is not known for very much, but it has to be said that he continued the policies of détente, meaning a better relationship with the Soviet Union. He was the president during the bicentennial, and that's a significant milestone. When people look back, I remember as a child how important the bicentennial was. That means in 1976, America celebrated its 200th anniversary. And so President Ford was a part of that. He was a president that did not get the United States into new wars, but he also pardoned President Nixon, and he was seen as continuing that cycle of deception or corruption, even though there's no evidence that he himself was corrupt. President Carter then won election in 1976, and this was a huge shift when in 1974 Democrats had made huge gains in Congress, and then President Carter was elected, and so basically you had a Democrat president and a Democrat Congress, and things should have moved forward very smoothly, but they did not. President Carter is often cited among some of the worst presidents in history. And President Carter gets blamed for a bad economy that included stagflation. Stagnation meant economic decline and high unemployment, but also inflation, where the prices are going up, and that is so painful for people. And in addition, it seemed like militarily we were losing everything to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Iran had a revolution, and our hostages were captured in Tehran, in Iran, and were held for 444 days through much of President Carter's presidency. And he was saddled with that. He was buried by that. And it was very difficult for him, and he did not win re-election then. Now, I'm going to talk about these next few pretty quickly because I think I've said enough, but President Reagan is famous for saying, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And he won because Americans looked around and they said, no, we're not better off than we were when President Carter took office. And so that was one thing he said. Another thing that he said is, it's morning again in America. And what he meant was that it had been nighttime with darkness. And, Iran released the hostages on his inauguration day. It was extremely symbolic. And there's a sense that Ronald Reagan was maybe negotiating, or somehow he showed that he would change things with Iran. And so they released the hostages when he took over. And it's seen as a very political move. And I remember that people thought that it seemed wrong, that there was a connection between a new president being sworn into office and those hostages being released. After President Reagan served 8 years, we know that he fought as a Cold Warrior against the Soviet Union and built up the military. He talked about building a system in space to shoot down missiles, and it was called Star Wars to kind of make fun of it. Eventually, that program did not get developed, but the spending that happened in the military helped to end the Cold War because the Soviet Union couldn't keep up. And Premier Gorbachev took over in the Soviet Union. President Reagan's vice president took over, and he was George H.W. Bush, and he is known for promising that he would not raise taxes. And then he raised taxes. He was a pragmatic man. He had served as an ambassador in China. He knew that relationships with other countries had to be carefully tended and taken care of. He also built a coalition to fight the Iraq War, the Gulf War. That happened in 1991. And it was very significant because Kuwait, a small nation in the Middle East, was invaded by Iraq, and Saudi Arabia was threatened. And President George H.W. Bush sent many hundreds of thousands of troops and was able to get a group of allies together, and it was seen as a major victory for him. And his approval ratings were very high. But then the economy went into recession, and his approval ratings dropped dramatically. So Bill Clinton was elected in 1992. Again, another big shift after a long period of Republican rule or Republican administrations. And then Bill Clinton basically experienced the dot-com boom when the internet was created. And there were many problems in Clinton's presidency. There were conflicts in the U.S. There were terrorist attacks, namely in Oklahoma City. There was a bombing of a federal building. There was also a problem in Texas called the with the Branch Davidians, and we will talk about them later, where their compound was stormed by federal officers and people died as a result. There were many problems, but people generally looked at the Clinton presidency as being positive because economic growth was better and better, and the country was working through peaceful relationships with other countries, specifically in the Middle East. Israel and Palestine were coming to an agreement of how to coexist. And we see today that that's still a big problem. But President Clinton has a legacy of those things. Unfortunately, it's overshadowed by his impeachment. And it happened because he made very, very bad choices. And he didn't realize that people looked up to him as a president, as had been the case with President Nixon. Another Bush then took over after President Clinton served 8 years, and President George W. Bush is really best known because of 9/11 and what happened as a result, which was the war on terror, beginning the war in Afghanistan, eventually the war in Iraq, second war in Iraq to get rid of Saddam Hussein, who had been the leader who had invaded Kuwait back in 1991. That happened in 2003. And so George W. Bush had war throughout his 8 years in office. And the war in Afghanistan is still going on today, essentially. President George W. Bush is also remembered for changing some of the relationships that we have with other countries. He did lead some allies into war in Iraq, but there was resistance against his leadership from France, for example. And so that was a different way that the United States was leading. It was a different style than his father had used. Finally, we need to look at President Obama, and probably the most notable thing that happened, two things. One was he was able to issue the order to capture or kill Osama bin Laden, who had been responsible for 9/11, and he also passed the American the Affordable Care Act, which is usually called Obamacare, health care for people at a certain level of income. So I have gone on and on about these presidents, and I'm trying to help you remember each president and what they're known for. And today we have a new president, Donald Trump. What do you think he'll be known for? Things are happening even today, even as I make this video, which could change how he's remembered. And we have to be fair to people today and to people in history. We have to know that the job of being president, it's only one job. And America is really shaped by every single American doing various jobs and working to take care of their families and working for a better life and caring about what happens in the future, especially an eternal future. The faith life of Americans is something that is very unique, very vibrant. And so we will talk about that in our last installment. But for right now, just remember all of these presidents for their strengths and their weaknesses, for their ups and downs. So I took quite a long time there to talk about the various presidents, and I'm going to go a little faster here. I'm going to try really hard to talk about the wars that have been fought since World War II. I'm going to start with the forgotten war, the Korean War. We know that the Korean War was the first United Nations war. It was also a war against communism, and it was the result of a failed agreement at Yalta that led to the Soviet Union taking over North Korea, the northern part, and not following through on allowing it the freedom to elect its own leaders and to have a democracy. And what ended up happening is a dividing line between communism and capitalism. And it was almost a total failure. If it hadn't been for, the last minute efforts of heroes invading Incheon, that war would have ended very differently. And today, the whole Korean peninsula would be communist, most likely. So this forgotten war actually ruined the presidency of President Truman, and it's kind of sad that it is a forgotten war, so that many who came back from that war, they didn't experience the parades that had been given for heroes in World War II. The Vietnam War is even more of a negative war for Americans. There are many, including my own great uncle. He fought in the Korean War and had no trouble being received well, as almost as a part of the World War II effort that had continued. He was seen as someone who had fought honorably. Unfortunately, those who fought in Vietnam did not face the same support and encouragement. They were seen as somehow on an enemy's side. They were accused of killing children, the worst accusation you could make. And so these young men who had gone off to the Vietnam War, they came back, many of them with injuries, many of them with psychological scars, and it was very difficult for them to be accepted. And they felt that they had been betrayed by their government, who had hidden information from the American public. So the Vietnam War, its legacy is one of extreme trauma. You still see it today. Everything that is going on in the world, we keep comparing it to Vietnam because that is kind of the low point of America fighting wars in other countries and saying it's a war for freedom, but really having that be very unclear. The Gulf War in 1991 in many ways was a restoration of the American spirit. We were fighting for the little guy, the underdog, Kuwait, which had been invaded by Saddam Hussein, and we also wanted to support Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia wasn't necessarily our best friend, but we did have a relationship to receive their oil. And so many accused the United States of fighting a war for oil. And there were many protests against the Gulf War. But what happened was it was won so quickly and so overwhelmingly. It was clear that American technology was far ahead of the enemy. And so the images that came back to Americans were stunning. And one thing that happened was CNN became the news network that was on the scene, and you could actually sit in your house and watch a war happening. This was the first time ever. Back in Vietnam, there was plenty of news footage each night that had been gathered, but nothing like CNN, which was 24 hours a day, and you could literally sit there and watch a battle. So that was the Gulf War, and it wasn't a complete victory. The U.S. and its allies, and it was quite a large coalition, were able to free Kuwait. But a decision was made by George H.W. Bush not to invade Iraq and get rid of Saddam Hussein. As a result, for 15 years, almost, let's say 12 years. For 12 years, Saddam Hussein basically thumbed his nose at the United States by challenging the structures that were set in place for him to disarm, for him to reveal his weapons. He was known to use chemical weapons even on people who were rebelling in his own country. He used gas on his own country, his own people, and killed them in large numbers. Innocent children, women, the elderly, not soldiers. So we knew that Saddam Hussein was a very bad man. And it was understood that he was challenging the United Nations and challenging the United States and saying, you have no right to ask us to show you things and to tell you what we are doing. And that led people to think that he was hiding even worse weapons, maybe even an atomic bomb of some kind. And there was a lot of research being done, and then the country tried to show that Iraq was hiding weapons of mass destruction. That led George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush, it led George W. Bush to preemptively attack Iraq. This happened after weapons investigators had been forced to leave the country, and so it was clear that Iraq was not going to tolerate other countries pushing it around, but the United States, for the first time, attacked a country before we were attacked. We call that preemptive war. And so that was what the Iraq War was. Again, it was a massive victory by the United States, plowing through Iraq, and it looked like it was easy. And Saddam Hussein was toppled. In fact, his statue was pulled down, and you can find that image very easily on the internet. But the aftermath is what was just shocking. For more than 5 years, the Iraqi people did not accept that the United States had won. And there were many people who supported Saddam Hussein or who just had a hate for these occupying forces. And as a result, there were insurrections and a rising up of people fighting terrorist warfare, guerrilla warfare against the United States, putting roadside bombs that would explode and kill soldiers who were simply on patrol trying to be police officers. And so the Iraq War is remembered as being a massive failure because of the unrest it created. It led to ISIS. It led to Al-Qaeda coming back stronger in many ways, which was the group that had been responsible for 9/11. There was some connection that was alluded to by the U.S. government to justify going to war. But in the end, there was no connection that was established between Iraq and Al-Qaeda, meaning Osama bin Laden. Now, 3 wars that have to do with the Balkans, Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union, which had become Russia, the Russian Federation. We have to talk about the Chechen War, which was basically a breakaway province, a province in the Soviet Union that wanted to be independent. They were largely Muslim, and this area wanted to be on its own, and so they fought against the Soviet government, but the Soviet government was far stronger. Unfortunately, you have many civilians who are caught in the crossfire, and this was a time of great instability in the Russian Federation. The Soviet Union had fallen, and so it was unclear how Russia would become a modern country and a democracy. They were having to put out fires in their own country, and they abused their own people as a result. Another conflict that happened in the 1990s was the Bosnian War, and this was a terrible war that lasted for half of the 1990s. It was basically a result of the breakup of Yugoslavia, which had been forced group in the Balkan Peninsula, and they were mushed together after World War I. Remember the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and remember all those countries that were fighting each other, all the people who were fighting for their own independence from Austria-Hungary, and they also wanted other people's territory. So the result was the Bosnian War, and in Bosnia you had the city of Sarajevo. That's where World War I started, so these conflicts were very old. And you had the Croatia fighting the Serbs. That was a huge part of the conflict. But you also had Muslims who were living in Bosnia, and they were seen as completely foreign, even though they had been living there for centuries, and they were massacred. It was a genocide of Muslims in Bosnia. There were mass graves that were discovered, terrible crimes against humanity that were committed as a result of the Bosnian War. Finally, that war was negotiated. A peace was negotiated, and President Clinton had a big part in that. That didn't end the conflict, though, and you had the Kosovo War, which was basically in Serbia, but there was a small portion that was, Muslims who were Albanian in background. So Albania is right next to Serbia, and this kind of border area called Kosovo was claimed by Serbia, and they were trying to get rid of all of the Muslims there. They called it ethnic cleansing, to get rid of people who were different ethnically. It was a horrific, terrible thing that was being done. As a result, the United States did attack Serbia and bombed Serbia for more than a month, or about a month. And so that was the Kosovo War, and the result was the United Nations was able to protect Kosovo, and even to this day, it's independent, but it's not. It's very uneasy how Serbia will treat Kosovo, because it still feels it has a claim to Kosovo, and there's tension between the ethnic groups there. The war in Afghanistan is basically an extension of 9/11. You had Osama bin Laden training terrorists in Afghanistan, and you had the Taliban in Afghanistan who were responsible for terrible crimes against women, and they were making everybody follow Muslim Sharia law. And so that is ongoing. And in addition, the war on terror included countries all over the world that were fighting against terrorists. The problem was that that big war could include people who were simply being oppressed, like in the Soviet Union, where the Soviet Union could say they were fighting a war on terror against Muslims and forcing them to obey the central government. And again, it's the Russian Federation today. So if I say Soviet Union, you'll understand. So those are the wars. And it's not much shorter, this segment, but we'll speed it up as we go. There are several pieces of legislation that you need to know, and you need to think, how are those things being affected today? And the first is Brown v. Board of Education. This is the desegregation of schools, and it led to desegregation of the entire United States. We should all ask ourselves a question: is this still working today? Are black people and white people able to come together today? Or is there lingering racism and lingering segregation? There's evidence that there's a new kind of segregation that's happening because of income. And unfortunately, people of color are often in that group where they have a lower income, and so they don't have the same resources that people who are white have, because traditionally they've had more money. And so you have this issue today that schools that were integrated because of Brown v. Board of Education, they are becoming segregated again, where you have a predominantly white school, maybe in the suburbs of a city, where you have people who are wealthier, and then you have inner city black schools because that's where black people live. That kind of segregation is still happening all over the country. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, it was intended to get rid of any racism in our society. But remember, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a clear indication that the Civil Rights Act wasn't being upheld. It wasn't being enforced. And so even the Voting Rights Act wasn't being enforced. MLK had to go to LBJ and have a heart-to-heart talk, and I don't think that they always agreed on what needed to be done. Even though you have the Supreme Court declare something and you have laws that should protect people, those laws aren't always enforced. There seem to be what we call loopholes. ways for people to get out of doing what they should do. Roe v. Wade, I just want to say, that 1973 decision by the Supreme Court, it became the law of the land. And even though we personally may believe that abortion is a crime, we may believe that it is morally wrong, we follow what the law of the land is. And Roe v. Wade made it possible for women to choose for themselves what would happen if they became pregnant. Again, I personally have very strong beliefs about what I believe is right, and it's important that all Americans do have those beliefs, but the way that we change things is through voting, and we also have a system of government that can keep order and can, the Supreme Court is the referee. That may very well change. That is the news as of the time I'm making this video, that the Supreme Court may make a different decision this time, 30 years after Roe versus Wade. 35 years. It's gone very quickly, actually, 45 years. So my math is not very good. But the main thing is that we need to pay attention to what's going on related to these landmark court cases, this legislation, but also these the Supreme Court decisions. The Affordable Care Act of 2009, called Obamacare, has been controversial mainly because it seems to change the health care that Americans were used to for so many decades. And healthcare has been rising in costs, and so people who can't afford healthcare, they are very vulnerable in our society. The Affordable Care Act made it possible for people to get health insurance, but it also put a great burden on the government, and people would say it raised the deficit in our country, and that means that the government is spending more money than it has, more money than it brings in taxes, and you can't live in debt. That is something that we learn just in life, not just in our government. And tax cuts are sometimes the solution that political parties have. If you cut taxes, it gives people more money, and then they spend the money, and it can stimulate economic growth. But tax cuts also mean that the government has less money to spend on things like healthcare or Social Security or building roads. Right now, we have what's called gridlock, and this has not been the case. You saw during the Great Society and LBJ, they were able to pass legislation through Congress and change our country very dramatically. The same thing was true with the Affordable Care Act. It was a Democrat Congress and a Democrat president, and they were basically able to pass that very, very new legislation that changed things. Again, not everybody liked it. It was very unpopular at first. It's grown more popular, though, with time, as people realize they need this health care, especially if they have a problem and they have no health insurance, they have a health problem. Many insurance companies will not give you insurance if you already have a problem. So today we have what's called gridlock because nothing's moving. You have no clear majority in Congress. Even though right now the Democrats control the House of Representatives, it was the Republicans for many years. And in the Senate, it's so close that you can never have a very clear majority. And right now, we're closer to having the president be Republican and the Senate be Republican, and we had the House of Representatives be Republican, but many things still did not pass through Congress because you had so many differences within the Republican Party. People just didn't agree. So that's our legacy for today, gridlock. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to solve this problem in our government so that we can pass laws to help Americans? It's the economy, stupid. Now, I'm not calling you stupid. I'm saying what Bill Clinton said, and he was actually very, very accurate. He was kind of saying what people would say to him. Back in 1992, when he was running for election against George H.W. Bush, even though President Bush had been so popular because of the victory in the Gulf War, it was the economy, stupid, and the economy tanked, and there was a recession, and that led people to say, we want change, we want a new president. Well, the economy is complicated. What you should know is that between Social Security and Medicare, the two entitlements that FDR and LBJ started, that is 40% of the U.S. budget each year. 40% are those two programs. And there are many people, particularly Republicans, who would say we need to just get rid of those. And we'll have so much money in our government to do things with, build roads and help schools and whatever needs to happen. The other portion of the economy is the national defense. Okay, that's at least another third of the pie each year. So 3/4 of the money in our country goes to Social Security, Medicare, and national defense. That leaves just a sliver of the pie to do other things to help people. Now, we have a very big economy in the U.S., but we also have to pay interest on our debts. And that's another significant portion of the pie. And so we have less and less money today to work with. And again, people disagree. Should we raise taxes to pay for more programs? Or should we lower taxes so that people will have more money and they'll stimulate economic growth by spending their money? When people spend money, companies grow, they hire more people, they have more money, and they are able to spend more money, and then everybody's happy. Happy days are here again. That basic idea of giving more money to people is called supply side economics. It's called trickle down economics. It's also called voodoo economics. The idea is if you give money to companies, that eventually it will help everybody. Because when companies grow, they will create jobs for people, and then having jobs is what it's all about. If you have a job, you can make a living. There is not agreement about that type of economics. There is a progressive movement in our country. Generally, we say supply side economics is the Republicans and progressive economics is Democrats. Progressive means that yes, you want the economy to grow, but you need to tax people, and you have a progressive tax, meaning the poor people pay a lower percentage in taxes and the rich people pay a higher percentage in taxes. Now, percentage is already a different amount, right? If I say rich people pay 10% and poor people pay 10%, they're going to pay very different amounts in taxes. But what they're saying actually is rich people need to pay a higher percentage because they have so much money and they can keep investing and keep making more money and more money and more money and become billionaires. So progressive taxation as opposed to flat taxation is a big debate in our country. And it's a debate that you are a part of, we all are, and we need to decide, what do taxes do? Should we trust the government to decide where our money goes, or should we keep it in our own pockets and spend it in our own way? There's a lot of evidence. The Great Depression is an example that when people have their own money, they don't necessarily contribute to the benefit of others. And that is the sinful human condition. And it's something we have to wrestle with, whether you're Democrat or Republican or independent. We need to wrestle with this. And finally, let's just kind of blast through the decades and try and remember what each decade, starting with the 1950s, is about, more or less. The 1950s is the baby boomer decade. It's the decade when men mostly, came back from war and they started families and they went back to school on what was called the GI Bill. The government supported their education. They are known as the greatest generation because they saved the world and they grew businesses. And the 1950s was a booming economy, but it was also beginning of the Cold War. There were Red Scares and spy scandals and great tension between the Soviet Union and the United States. There was also the beginning of a space program. The 1960s are remembered for a little bit of a backlash against the 1950s, where the 1950s was trying to create the perfect nuclear family. Nuclear means a nucleus family with, mother, father, son, and daughter, and maybe 2.3 children. On the average, it's kind of a joke. Where do we put the 0.3 child? But the main thing is the 1960s had many protest movements, and President Kennedy wasn't one who protested. He was actually very anti-communist for being a Democrat president, but there was a growing feeling that the government was going in the wrong direction, and the war in Vietnam just made that crystal clear. And even though great programs through the Great Society were happening, there was the hippie movement and the anti-war movement, the student protests, and a lot of sadness with things like the My Lai massacre. The 1970s then was another shift, and other groups other than African Americans were seeking equal rights, namely women, American Indians or Native Americans. And so the 1970s was a time of more push for equality and also a time of détente with the Soviet Union, at least the first half of the 1970s, but it was also a time of lingering scandal from Watergate. There was a crisis of confidence in the United States at the end of the decade, and this was captured by President Carter's humble speech on national television. He was criticized for it. It looked weak to some people, but we need to know he was a Christian man who still teaches Sunday school to this day at age 94. And he's someone who wanted to do the right thing, and he wanted Americans to see what was great about America, and he was concerned that Americans just had lost their focus. In the 1980s, that all changed with the election of Ronald Reagan. There was a new confidence in the country. There was this sense that we could defeat the Soviet Union if we spent enough on our military. And the economy was roaring, almost like the roaring 20s, and the stock market was going up, 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 up. But then in 1987, there was another crash. And many of the people who had gained wealth with kind of shady business dealings called junk bonds, their value went up, but then it crashed. And one of those caught in this development was our current president, Donald Trump. He lost $1 billion over a decade. So that's something, apart from whether it was his fault or not to lose that money. I mean, a lot of people lost a lot of money. And so if they had invested a lot, they could lose a lot at the end of the 1980s. And there was a recession then, and that was during the time of George H.W. Bush. The 1990s were known as, again, a time of economic growth because of the dot-com boom, the internet explosion. And it was also a time of growing terrorism around the world and in the United States. In the 2000s, then, it was a decade of war, and it happened because of 9/11, September 11th, 2001, and it lasted all the way into President Obama's administration after 2008. The 2010s, what have they been known for? I think they've been known for political division. And it's difficult at the end of this decade to look back and realize the amazing opportunities we've had. They seem to be in jeopardy right now. I think of climate change right now and the threat that it poses, and it's clear that we need some decisions to be made at the government level, at the highest levels in our country. So I hope this helps you understand the decades, as well as the presidents and key landmark court cases and pieces of legislation in our country. There's a lot to remember in U.S. history and world history, but I think that it's important to keep fighting the good fight. Thanks for watching.